The morning sun spread a soft golden glow over the streets of the small city, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. People were moving about in their usual way, shopkeepers opening their stores, children running to catch the school bus, and workers rushing toward offices and factories. It seemed like any other normal day. But on this very street, in front of the large brick police station, something unusual was about to unfold. A tall black man walked slowly down the sidewalk, dressed in plain clothes. He wore a neat shirt, dark trousers, and carried himself with a calm, confident posture. His eyes scanned the area quietly, almost as though he was taking in every detail of the place. He wasn't in a rush, and there was something about the way he walked that made him stand out. He didn't look nervous or hurried like the others, yet he also didn't seem to be demanding attention. It was simply the way he carried himself with quiet strength that drew a few curious looks from passers-by. Across the street, a white police officer leaned against the hood of his patrol car, sipping coffee from a paper cup. He was young, perhaps in his 30s, but carried the kind of arrogance that made him act as though he ruled the street. His uniform was crisp, his badge shining in the sun, and his body language said more than his face did. He had the look of someone who enjoyed being in power, someone who liked being noticed when he walked into a room. The officer noticed the black man approaching and narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't recognize him, and that was enough for suspicion to rise in his mind. The city wasn't big, and in his eyes, everyone who walked past the police station should look like they belonged. This man looked like an outsider, and to the officer, that was reason enough to judge. The officer put his cup down on the hood and stepped forward. "Hey, you," he called out loudly, his voice sharp enough to make a few pedestrians turn their heads. The black man paused and looked at him calmly. He didn't reply immediately, only adjusted his shirt sleeve as if he hadn't decided whether the man was even worth responding to. The silence stretched for a moment, and it annoyed the officer more than it should have. "I'm talking to you," the officer said again, walking closer. His boots clicked against the pavement, and his tone carried the weight of authority. "What are you doing here, hanging around outside the station?" The man finally answered, his voice steady and deep. "I'm just walking." Something about the calmness in that reply unsettled the officer, but instead of stepping back, he chose to push forward. He didn't like calmness. He preferred fear or obedience. "Just walking," the officer mocked, raising an eyebrow. "You think this is some kind of park? People don't just stroll around the police station unless they've got a reason." A small crowd began to form, not intentionally, but because people nearby had slowed down, sensing tension. Some stood by the store windows, pretending to browse, but their eyes stayed on the two men. The black man didn't answer right away. Instead, he continued to meet the officer's stare without flinching. It was not a stare of challenge, but of patience, like someone who was used to waiting for others to reveal who they truly were. The officer grew irritated. He didn't like that this stranger wasn't nervous. So, in a moment of arrogance, he stepped closer, standing barely 2 feet away. His voice dropped lower, but it carried even more bite. "You better explain yourself before I make you explain." Still, the black man stayed calm. "I don't think I need to explain my walk to you," he said slowly. The officer let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that was meant to humiliate, not to express humor. He looked around at the bystanders, as though asking for their approval. Some people shifted uncomfortably, while others looked down, unwilling to get involved. "You've got some nerve," the officer muttered, shaking his head. "Walking here like you own the place." He took another step, and then, in an act that shocked even those watching, the officer leaned slightly forward and spat near the man's shoes, the action filled with disrespect. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The black man looked down at the ground, then back up at the officer, his face still calm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move to strike back, didn't even look angry. His eyes, however, carried a weight that words could not match. The silence that followed was heavy. People nearby shifted uneasily, unsure what would happen next. One older woman whispered to her friend, "That's not right at all." But nobody dared step forward. The officer smirked, convinced he had won some kind of victory. He mistook the silence of the stranger for weakness. He thought respect came from fear, and when fear didn't show, he forced humiliation. But what he didn't know and what the crowd didn't yet realize was that this was not just any man. This man had a reason for being there. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He was here with purpose, and soon enough, the truth would unfold. The man took a small breath and straightened his back slightly taller, looking at the officer without blinking. His presence alone began to feel heavier, though no one understood why. The officer, blinded by his own ego, couldn't see the storm he was walking into. Around them, the city kept moving. Cars honked in the distance. A bus stopped and picked up passengers. But here, in front of the police station, it felt as though time had slowed. Every second stretched longer, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The black man didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than the officer's arrogance. And though the officer stood there, chest puffed, convinced he had made his point, something deep inside him felt unsettled. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt that maybe he had underestimated the man in front of him. But it was already too late. The crowd had seen his actions. The man had felt the insult. And destiny had already prepared the stage for the shocking reveal that was to come. This was only the beginning of a story the city would never forget. The officer's smirk lingered as he stepped back, as if his action had sealed his dominance. He crossed his arms over his chest, chin tilted high, satisfied that he had reminded everyone who held the badge and the authority on this street. The crowd watching shifted uneasily, whispering to one another in low tones. Some shook their heads, others simply looked down at their feet, pretending not to have seen. But the man who had been disrespected did not flinch. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stood there, tall and calm, as though nothing the officer had done could move him from his place. His silence unsettled a few of the onlookers. It wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence of someone who knew more than what met the eye. The officer, however, mistook this silence for weakness. He chuckled lightly, folding his arms tighter. "That's what I thought," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few people to hear. "You won't even defend yourself." The black man's eyes remained steady, watching him with quiet strength. It wasn't anger that showed in his face, but a kind of patience, as though he were letting the officer reveal more of himself with every passing moment. A young man in the crowd whispered to his friend, "Why isn't he saying anything? I'd be furious if someone did that to me." His friend shook his head. "No, don't you see? He doesn't need to fight back. Look at him. He's not afraid." The officer grew irritated again. He had expected shouting, maybe even an argument, something he could use as an excuse to escalate. Instead, the stranger's calmness felt like an invisible wall. No matter how much he pushed, it did not fall. That calmness embarrassed him more than any angry words could. "Say something," the officer demanded, his voice rising. He stepped forward again, jabbing a finger toward the man's chest. "Don't just stand there. You think you can look at me like that and walk away?" The stranger still did not respond. He blinked slowly, then shifted his gaze toward the ground for just a second before returning it back to the officer's face. His breathing was even, his hands resting at his sides without tension. The officer let out a frustrated laugh. "You're nothing," he spat out. "Just another man trying to act bigger than he is. This is my street. My station. You don't belong here." That last sentence struck a chord with some of the bystanders. A woman near the bakery frowned and whispered to her husband, "He doesn't belong? Who decides who belongs?" Her husband sighed, tugging her sleeve gently, silently warning her not to get involved. But the words had been heard by more than just her. They echoed quietly in the minds of those standing nearby. The stranger finally opened his mouth. His voice was calm, steady, almost gentle, but it carried weight. "Respect isn't earned by force," he said quietly. "It's earned by how you treat others." The officer froze for half a second before scoffing. "Don't start preaching to me," he barked. "You don't get to teach me about respect. You're the one standing out here like you're lost." He stepped even closer now, their faces only inches apart. His tone was sharp, his posture aggressive, as though daring the man to flinch. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath. The stranger did not flinch. His eyes, dark and steady, looked right through the officer, as though he could see something deeper than the uniform, deeper than the arrogance. The officer's smirk faltered just a little, though he tried to hide it with another laugh. The tension in the air thickened. Even those who had tried to walk away moments earlier found themselves drawn back, unable to ignore the scene. Something about it felt bigger than just a simple street argument. It felt like the beginning of something that would change the way people saw this officer, maybe even the way they saw the entire station. The officer, desperate to regain control, puffed out his chest and raised his voice so everyone could hear. "See this, people? This is what happens when someone thinks they can walk around like they own the place. No respect for the law, no respect for authority." He gestured toward the stranger as if presenting evidence of wrongdoing. But the crowd wasn't nodding along the way he expected. They weren't laughing or agreeing. Instead, many had crossed their arms, their faces serious. A few shook their heads in quiet disapproval. The officer noticed, and the lack of support made him restless. He turned back to the man. "I should take you in right now," he threatened. "One call, one word, and you'll be behind bars before you can blink. That's how this works. My word against yours. Who do you think they'll believe?" The stranger tilted his head slightly, his calmness unbroken. "Truth has a way of showing itself," he said softly. For the first time, a flicker of unease passed across the officer's face. He tried to cover it with another sneer, but his eyes betrayed him. He was no longer as sure of himself as he had been a few minutes earlier. The silence stretched again, thicker now, heavier. Even the breeze seemed to pause, carrying only the faint sound of a flag rustling against its pole above the police station. Everyone felt that something important was happening, though they could not yet name it. A young boy holding his mother's hand tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Why doesn't the man get angry?" His mother bent down slightly, her voice hushed. "Because sometimes, strength isn't about shouting. Sometimes, it's about standing tall and saying nothing." The officer heard none of this. He was too wrapped up in his own frustration, too blinded by his need to be seen as the strongest man on the street. He leaned closer again, his tone sharp and dripping with mockery. "Look at you. Not even brave enough to answer properly. You think silence makes you strong? It just makes you weak." But his words no longer landed the way he thought they did. The crowd, though still silent, began to look at him differently. Some of them glanced between the two men, comparing them, weighing them. And slowly, it became clear that the one standing calmly was not the weak one. The officer, however, could not see what everyone else was beginning to sense. He was too caught up in the performance of authority, too desperate to prove himself. He took one more step closer, so close that he was almost invading the man's personal space. The stranger did not move. His eyes stayed locked on the officer's, unshaken. And for just a moment, the officer felt something he hadn't expected, a twinge of doubt, a small ripple of fear deep in his chest. He didn't understand it, but he felt it. Still, he pressed on, unwilling to back down. "This is your last chance," he hissed. "Walk away before I make you." The man did not move. He did not turn. His voice came again, steady and calm, carrying further than the officer's shouting ever could. One day, you will learn who truly holds authority. And when that day comes, you will remember this moment." The officer laughed again, but this time his laugh sounded hollow. It echoed against the brick wall of the station but didn't carry the same confidence as before. The crowd noticed. They exchanged glances, sensing cracks in the officer's confidence. The air grew heavy once more, and though nothing had changed outwardly, everyone knew this wasn't over. Something bigger was waiting just around the corner, something that would turn this moment into a lesson none of them would ever forget. And through it all, the stranger stood still, his calmness unshaken, his dignity untouchable. This was only the second chapter of a story that was far from finished. The tension that had gripped the street did not fade. The officer's chest heaved, his eyes darting around nervously now, trying to find allies in the crowd who might back him up, but all he found were faces filled with curiosity and doubt. The whispers grew louder, like a low hum of anticipation. People were beginning to sense that this was not an ordinary encounter, and the officer could feel it. His sense of control was slipping like sand through his fingers. The black man took a single step forward, just enough to reduce the distance between them by half a foot. The officer's hand twitched toward his belt, a reflex he couldn't suppress. But the man didn't move threateningly. He didn't raise a fist or yell. He just stood there, calm, like a rock unmoved by the storm. His voice broke the silence, low but commanding. "You think power comes from fear, but it does not. It comes from responsibility." The officer laughed nervously, an awkward sound that made some of the bystanders exchange knowing looks. One elderly woman whispered to her companion, "I've seen plenty of men like him, all pride and bravado. But real strength is quiet." That statement seemed to echo in the officer's mind. For the first time, he noticed that the man standing in front of him carried himself differently than anyone else he had met in the force. His posture was straight, his shoulders relaxed, yet his presence was undeniable. It wasn't something that could be faked with a badge or a uniform. "You're bluffing," the officer muttered, trying to regain his composure. "You don't even work here. Who are you to tell me about responsibility?" The man's gaze did not waver. "I work here. I have always worked here," he said quietly, almost as if letting the words hang in the air for the officer to grasp their meaning. "And soon, I will lead it." The officer froze. There was a pause so long it felt like the world itself had stopped. The words barely registered, but they were enough to plant a seed of panic. What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice shaky now, betraying the confidence he had displayed earlier. The crowd leaned in, sensing the shift. Even those who had been skeptical of the stranger's calm demeanor now leaned forward in anticipation. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The officer took a small step back, uncertainty creeping into his posture. "I am the new police chief," the man said, his voice firm now, carrying authority that did not need to be demanded. "Effective immediately, I am responsible for this precinct and everyone in it. That includes you." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Murmurs turned into whispers, and whispers turned into stunned silence. No one expected this revelation. The officer's eyes widened. His face turned pale, the color draining away as the reality sank in. All the arrogance, all the bravado, it dissolved in an instant. You can't be serious," the officer muttered, his tone laced with panic. "I've been here for years. I know the streets." "Years do not always equal authority," the man interrupted gently but firmly. "Experience is important, but respect, judgment, and leadership, these are the qualities that make a chief, not mere time served or a badge worn." The officer's lips quivered. He looked around at the faces of the people who had been silently observing. They weren't looking at him with fear anymore. They were looking with curiosity, some with admiration, many with a quiet sense of justice finally being acknowledged. His authority had evaporated in an instant. A younger officer standing nearby whispered, almost to himself, "I can't believe this, he's the chief?" And he just walked up here like this. The new chief's eyes softened slightly, but the weight of command remained. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His calm presence alone made the officer realize how small his earlier display of arrogance had been. "You," the officer said, still stammering. You can't just take over like that." "People will they already know," the chief interrupted. "People already know who I am. They know how I treat them, how I expect others to be treated. And they know that fear is not the measure of power." The officer's mind raced. He had thought he could intimidate anyone. He had thought his badge, his uniform, and his rank gave him complete control over every situation. But standing here, faced with someone who embodied real authority, he felt powerless. It was an unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time it was not in confusion or tension. It was excitement. They were witnessing a moment of justice, of truth, unfolding before their eyes. A few people even took out their phones, quietly capturing the scene. The chief's gaze turned to the officer, calm but unwavering. "You spat on me," he said quietly. "And in doing so, you revealed something about yourself." The officer swallowed hard, unable to respond. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and ashamed. The act that had once given him confidence now seemed like the exact mistake that would define him in this precinct for years to come. "You have a choice," the chief continued. "You can continue down the path you are on, letting arrogance and anger dictate your actions. Or you can choose to learn, to respect, and to serve as an officer should. Your decision will define the rest of your career." The officer's shoulders slumped. For the first time, he realized that the power he had relied on for so long was empty without wisdom, integrity, and respect. He looked around at the people who had been watching silently, and he felt the weight of their judgment not just as bystanders, but as witnesses to the kind of change that was happening here. "Sir," the officer finally muttered, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. I didn't know." You didn't know," the chief said, finishing the sentence for him. "Now you do. And that knowledge can guide you, if you choose to let it." There was a stillness in the air. Even the birds seemed to pause, sensing the gravity of the moment. The street that had been tense, hostile, and heavy with fear now carried a different energy. It was a quiet energy of understanding, of realization, and of respect slowly being restored. The officer swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. He looked at the chief, really looked at him for the first time. The man's face was calm, kind, but it radiated authority in a way that no uniform or badge could. The officer felt a strange mix of fear, awe, and curiosity. He did not understand it fully, but he knew it was a turning point. The chief's eyes scanned the street, taking in the bystanders, the young boy and his mother, the older couples, and the other officers who had been lingering. Leadership is not about fear. It is about service. It is about knowing when to act, and knowing when to listen. That is how trust is earned, and how respect grows. The officer nodded slowly, though his face still carried shame. He realized that the display he had used to assert authority had done the opposite. It had shown weakness, not strength. And now, faced with someone who truly embodied leadership, he had no choice but to confront the truth about himself. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some whispering about what had just happened, others just staring in awe. But the energy of the encounter remained. Everyone who had witnessed it knew that something important had shifted, not just between the two men, but in the perception of justice, authority, and respect on this street. The officer remained, silent and uncertain. The chief turned slightly, giving him a small, understanding nod, and then walked calmly back toward the station. Every step he took carried weight, quiet authority, and the unmistakable presence of a leader. And the officer knew, deep in his heart, that he would never forget this moment. He would never forget the man who had stood silently, confidently, and unshakably. He would never forget that true power did not come from fear, force, or anger, but from integrity, patience, and respect. For the first time in his career, the officer felt the weight of responsibility not just in his badge, but in his actions and choices. And for the first time, he understood that respect could not be demanded, it had to be earned. The street remained quiet, the tension slowly fading, replaced with a sense of possibility. The world had shifted in subtle ways, and the lesson learned on that corner would ripple through the precinct and the community for years to come. The new chief had not raised his voice. He had not yelled, threatened, or demanded obedience. He had only stood tall, spoken the truth, and shown the officer and the entire crowd that real authority was rooted in character, not in intimidation. And as he disappeared into the station, the officer finally understood, the world was bigger than his badge, stronger than his pride, and wiser than his anger. And that understanding, though hard-earned, was the beginning of a new chapter not just for him, but for the entire. The days that followed the street incident were unlike anything the precinct had ever experienced. The news spread quickly, first through whispers among officers, then through the town, until everyone seemed to know about what had happened and who the new chief was. The black man who had been spat on had stepped into his role with quiet authority, and people were beginning to notice the changes he was bringing. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere shifted subtly but unmistakably. Officers who had once relied on fear and intimidation now found themselves adjusting to a leadership style that demanded integrity, patience, and fairness. Some were skeptical, unsure how they would fit into this new world. Others were quietly inspired, recognizing that the chief's approach was not about power for personal gain, but about service to the community and the team. The officer who had spat on the chief was no exception. He felt a constant weight on his shoulders, a mix of fear, guilt, and curiosity. Every interaction with colleagues reminded him of the incident, and every time he saw the chief, he remembered the calm authority that had left him speechless on the street. He began to reflect, often alone in his home at night, replaying the words he had heard: leadership is not about fear. It is about service. It is about knowing when to act, and knowing when to listen. At first, he tried to ignore these thoughts, brushing them away with pride and defensiveness. But they would not leave him. They followed him during his patrols, while he filled out reports, and even during casual conversations with citizens. He began to realize that his actions, meant to assert control, had only revealed weaknesses. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that he had a choice: continue living in arrogance, or change. The new chief, for his part, did not make it easy. He implemented new training sessions that emphasized communication, de-escalation, and respect. He encouraged officers to engage with the community in ways they had never done before, attending school meetings, visiting local events, and listening to the concerns of citizens rather than simply enforcing rules. Some officers resisted, believing this was beneath them, while others began to see the value in building trust instead of fear. The officer who had once spat on the chief found himself forced to participate in these programs. At first, he approached them with resistance, his pride bristling at the idea that he could learn from someone who had not only humbled him but had also become his superior. But slowly, he began to notice small changes in his own attitude. The conversations with citizens, the moments of genuine listening, and even the recognition of his own mistakes began to chip away at the layers of arrogance he had built over the years. One afternoon, the chief organized a community meeting at the local recreation center. Officers and residents came together to discuss safety, concerns, and ways to work together. The officer who had spat on the chief was assigned to the front, his presence a subtle reminder to everyone that past mistakes did not define the future, they were opportunities for growth. During the meeting, a young boy approached him, nervous but determined. "Sir," the boy said, "my friends and I feel scared sometimes when officers come to our neighborhood. Can you promise us that you'll listen before you act?" The officer froze. For years, he had been trained to assert control, to act first, and to question later. But now, faced with the boy's honest question, he felt something shift inside him. He looked up at the chief, who stood quietly observing from the side, and then back at the boy. I can promise that, the officer said, his voice sincere. I will listen, and I will try to understand before I act. Thank you for speaking up. The boy smiled, a small but genuine gesture, and ran back to his friends. The officer felt a warmth he had not experienced in years, a quiet satisfaction that did not come from fear, control, or dominance. It came from doing the right thing. The chief later approached him after the meeting. You handled that well, he said simply. Not perfectly, but well. Progress begins with small steps. The officer nodded, feeling the weight of the chief's approval more strongly than any praise he had received in the past. It was not about ego, it was about growth, learning, and responsibility. Over the following weeks, the precinct began to feel like a different place. Officers who had once ignored community concerns now sought them out. Citizens who had been wary of police interactions began to engage more openly, sensing a genuine effort to connect and understand. And the officer who had once spat on the chief found himself changing in ways he had never anticipated. He started listening more, questioning less, and reflecting on the impact of his actions before making decisions. One evening, after a long day of patrols, he found himself walking through a neighborhood he had often treated with impatience. He noticed a group of teenagers sitting on the curb, talking and laughing. In the past, he would have assumed the worst, thinking they were troublemakers. But now, he approached slowly, greeting them politely and asking about their day. To his surprise, they responded warmly, and a genuine conversation unfolded. He realized he had been judging people before even knowing them, relying on assumptions and stereotypes that had nothing to do with reality. The chief's influence extended beyond formal duties. He had a way of inspiring reflection, making officers confront not just their professional responsibilities but their personal attitudes as well. The officer realized that he had been blind to his own faults, letting pride and fear drive his actions for years. Now, he was learning to approach life differently, to consider the impact of his choices, and to seek improvement in both his work and personal relationships. One rainy afternoon, the officer was called to assist in a situation involving a minor accident. A car had skidded on the wet pavement, and the driver, an elderly woman, was frightened and shaken. In the past, he might have focused solely on procedural details, ensuring rules were followed. But this time, he knelt beside her, speaking softly, reassuring her, and taking the time to listen to her concerns. He noticed how the chief's earlier lessons, empathy, patience, calm authority, guided his actions without him even realizing it. By the end of the day, he reflected on how far he had come. The incident with the new chief had been a turning point, not just for his career but for his character. He understood now that leadership and respect were earned through action, patience, and integrity. He had learned that mistakes could be opportunities for growth, and that humility was not a weakness but a strength. The chief, observing quietly from his office, had noticed the changes as well. He understood that true leadership was not just about making rules or giving orders, it was about inspiring change, even in those who had once resisted it. And as he watched the officer grow, he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the influence of calm, fair authority could ripple outward, transforming not just a single individual, but the culture of an entire precinct. Word of the chief's approach spread beyond the precinct. Other departments took notice, and local leaders began inviting him to speak about community engagement, leadership, and the importance of integrity in law enforcement. The officer who had once spat on him found himself listening to these speeches, taking notes, and even implementing some of the strategies in his own work. He realized that the lessons were not just professional, they were life lessons, shaping him into a better person, both on and off duty. By the end of the month, the officer had started mentoring newer recruits, sharing with them the lessons he had learned the hard way. He emphasized the importance of respect, patience, and thoughtful action. And every time he spoke, he remembered that day on the street, the moment he had been humbled, the moment he had realized the difference between fear and true authority. The precinct began to transform, slowly but surely. Citizens felt safer, officers felt more purpose, and the community began to rebuild trust that had been fragile for years. The officer, once consumed by arrogance and pride, now carried a sense of responsibility and awareness that guided every decision he made. He had learned the most important lesson: power alone does not define a person, character does. And though the memory of that street encounter would never fade, it became a source of reflection, a reminder that every choice mattered, and that change was always possible. The officer had been given a second chance not just in his career, but in his approach to life. And for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went far beyond rank, badge, or authority. The chief had taught him, and the experience had shown him, that respect and leadership were built slowly, through actions, understanding, and integrity. And as the officer walked through the precinct each day, he carried that lesson with him, quietly shaping his future, and the future of everyone he served. Weeks turned into months, and the city slowly began to notice the difference the new chief had brought. It was not about flashy actions or headlines, but small, steady changes that built trust, respect, and a sense of safety in the community. People felt heard for the first time in a long while, and officers began to take pride not just in their work, but in the way they treated others. The officer who had once spat on the chief continued his personal journey of transformation. His pride, once sharp and unyielding, had softened into humility. He now understood that respect could not be demanded, it had to be earned, and it began with understanding, listening, and acting with fairness. Every day brought new challenges, but he approached them with a sense of responsibility he had never known before. One morning, he was called to a domestic situation. A woman had reported a dispute with her neighbor over a property line. In the past, he would have focused only on rules and regulations, enforcing boundaries without thought of the human emotions involved. But now, he took a deep breath and listened to both sides. He asked questions calmly, made sure everyone felt heard, and helped them find a solution that respected both parties. By the end of the day, what could have been a conflict full of anger and resentment ended with a handshake and understanding. He realized that every interaction, no matter how small, could create ripples. One good choice could lead to trust, and trust could change relationships, communities, and even lives. The lessons from the chief were no longer just ideas, they were habits, guiding his thoughts and actions in ways that felt natural, even necessary. Word of the changes in the precinct reached the local media. Stories appeared in newspapers and on local TV, highlighting how community interactions had improved, how complaints had decreased, and how citizens felt safer walking the streets. The officer felt a quiet pride, but it was different from the pride of past achievements. It was deeper, more meaningful. It came from knowing that his actions, guided by fairness and understanding, had contributed to something greater than himself. One afternoon, the officer received a call from the chief. "Meet me at the community center in an hour," the chief said. There was no explanation, only a simple request. Curious, the officer arrived to find a group of residents and city officials gathered. The chief was standing at the front, calm, composed, and confident. "I want to recognize someone today," the chief began, scanning the room. "Someone who has worked hard to change, to grow, and to lead by example. Someone who has shown that mistakes do not define us, but how we respond to them does." He paused, looking directly at the officer. "You have taken a journey of reflection and action, and it has not gone unnoticed." The officer felt his heart pound. He had never been praised in this way, not for bravery, not for skill, but for becoming a better person. The room erupted in applause, not just for him, but for the idea that anyone could change for the better. Citizens smiled, and some nodded in understanding, realizing that transformation was possible for everyone, not just those in authority. The chief continued, "Leadership is not about titles, badges, or fear. It is about service, humility, and responsibility. Today, we celebrate someone who embodies these values." He handed the officer a certificate of recognition, a simple piece of paper, but to the officer, it felt like a symbol of the journey he had traveled from pride and ignorance to awareness and integrity. As the applause died down, a young girl stepped forward, holding a handmade card. "Thank you," she said shyly. "I saw how you helped my neighbor and how you listened to people. You made me feel safe." The officer knelt to her level, smiling genuinely. "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise to keep listening, learning, and helping whenever I can." Walking home that evening, he reflected on everything that had happened. The memory of spitting on the chief, once a source of shame, now served as a reminder of how far he had come. He realized that it was not just about his own growth, it was about the impact he could have on others, the chance to make the world a little safer, kinder, and fairer every day. The chief's leadership had created a culture of accountability and reflection. Officers learned not only to follow the law but to understand the people behind the law. Citizens, in turn, learned to trust and communicate rather than fear and hide. And the officer who had once acted out of arrogance now understood that true strength lay in service, empathy, and integrity. One weekend, the precinct organized a family day at the local park. Officers and residents mingled, played games, and shared meals. The officer found himself helping a group of teenagers with a soccer game, cheering them on, and listening to their stories. For the first time in years, he felt fully connected to his community, not as a figure of authority who demanded obedience, but as a human being who cared. During a quiet moment, the chief walked up beside him. "You've done well," the chief said simply. "Not perfectly, but well. Keep building on this. Change is not a single event, it is a lifelong process." The officer nodded, understanding more deeply than ever. He knew he would face challenges, mistakes, and moments of doubt, but he had learned how to navigate them with honesty and humility. He had learned that leadership was about example, not fear, and that respect was earned through action, not demanded through authority. Months passed, and the precinct became a model for other departments in the state. Leaders came to observe, hoping to replicate the balance of professionalism, empathy, and community engagement. The officer continued to mentor younger recruits, sharing his story and experiences, hoping to teach them that mistakes did not define them, but reflection and action could transform them. One day, a former colleague approached him. "I never thought you'd change," the colleague said. "But you have. You really have." The officer smiled, not out of pride, but out of recognition that growth was a journey. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about doing what's right, learning from mistakes, and making a positive difference every day." The incident that had once been a source of shame became a lesson for the entire department. Officers learned that accountability, humility, and service were not just ideals, they were the foundation of effective law enforcement. Citizens learned that change was possible, and trust could be rebuilt with effort, integrity, and care. As the officer walked the streets, he saw familiar faces smiling and waving. Children ran up to him, neighbors thanked him, and even those who had been skeptical began to show respect. It was a new reality, one built on action, not words, on reflection, not arrogance. Looking back, he realized that the moment on the street, the moment he had spat on the chief, was not just a mistake. It was a turning point. Without it, he might never have confronted his own pride or learned the value of true leadership. Without it, he might never have discovered the power of service, integrity, and humility. The chief continued to lead, calm and firm, guiding the precinct through challenges and successes alike. And the officer, once defined by anger and arrogance, became a living example of transformation. Together, they reshaped not just a police department, but a community, proving that respect, integrity, and understanding could overcome fear, pride, and prejudice. And in that transformation, the officer found something he had never expected: peace. Peace with himself, peace with his past, and a sense of purpose that went far beyond his badge or title. He had learned the hard way that character mattered more than power, and that every choice, every action, and every moment offered a chance to grow. In the end, the city, the precinct, and the officer himself were all changed not by force, not by fear, but by understanding, patience, and the quiet power of doing what was right. And the memory of that street incident remained, not as a mark of shame, but as a symbol of the journey from arrogance to integrity, from fear to respect, and from mistake to transformation. The officer often thought back to that first day, the day he had met the new chief, and he could barely believe how far he had come. From humiliation to growth, from anger to understanding, and from arrogance to true leadership, he had discovered a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life: real power comes from character, and real respect comes from action. And with that knowledge, he walked forward with confidence, not of superiority, but of understanding, ready to continue serving his community, his colleagues, and himself in the best way he could.